So Dr. Potee is a local family doctor at Valley Medical Group in Greenfield, and she's a native of Western Massachusetts. In addition to her family practice and her many other accomplishments, Dr. Potee is the chair of the Healthcare Solutions of the Opioid Task Force of Franklin County. And Dr. Potee is widely recognized as a leader in the fight against heroin addiction. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Ruth Potee.
Superintendent. That was very nice, and thank you everyone being here. It's really hard to come out on a school night because I know everybody has homework to do, and there's a basketball game over there that if this gets boring, that looks really fun. And people's lives are really busy. I'm sure everybody in this room already worked a full day, and then to sit here and what actually is kind of a nice night is pretty dreadful. So thank you for being here, and I appreciate everybody here inviting me. And just, I have to say, this East Hampton Coalition is pretty darn impressive. There's a lot of very important work that happens in Hampshire County, and it's really happening right here. It's great. So we're going to dive in. I have these slides. I'll share them with anyone, but I actually have this as a YouTube video, so if you want to share it with somebody, it's at the Opioid Task Force website, but it's a nicely done YouTube video as well, and I think it's also getting recorded. But if you want to put it out there for people who weren't able to come, I'm happy that people take my slides and use them any way you want. That's fine with me too. So this is an article that came out in 1997 in Science magazine, and it said addiction is a brain disease and it matters. And ask yourself where you were in 1997. I was in medical school. I was almost done. But this is big news that this came out, and people are starting to acknowledge that this is a real malfunction of how the brain works. We're going to dive in on how the brain works, and no one gets quizzed. Nobody has to really remember all of this, but there's 3 areas of the brain that get largely impacted with addiction. It's the prefrontal cortex, the ventral tegmental area, and the nucleus accumbens. And of those 3 things, I know everybody in this room knew prefrontal cortex, because that is one of the critical parts of the brain that is not developed until age 24. So the problem is that this critical part of the brain is the reward center of the brain. It's the part of the brain that tells you that you have done a good job today. You got up, you found food, you found water, and although you thought your job was to go to work and walk the dog today, your job on this planet is to find a mate and to spread your genetic material forward. Because that is how we are programmed as mammals, right? You may think we've evolved, we have not evolved. That's the point. And so this reward center of the brain has to do with finding food, water, and finding sex. That's the point. It is evolutionarily ancient. It is this most critical survival part of the brain, and it is this part of the brain that is impacted with addiction. And if we can move that impact to somewhere else, like visual cortex or your hearing, and we just lost some peripheral vision when we got addicted, that would be a heck of a lot easier to deal with. So we've got to remember where this is impacting the head. We're going to spend time not talking about serotonin. A lot of people know serotonin. It's one of the neurotransmitters that modulates mood and sleep and how well your brain works. We're going to spend all of our time on dopamine, and on this slide, dopamine is the purple. And dopamine is the chemical that allows this positive feedback of saying, wow, that was great what you just did, finding a clean spring and healthy food. You need to keep going back for some more of that in order to survive. So dopamine gives you the sense of reward or joy or euphoria, and it has 2 behaviors associated with it. And those behaviors are compulsion and perseveration. Now, you want to be compulsive about finding food, water, and a mate, right? You want to perseverate on it. You want that to be the last thing you think of before you go to bed and the first thing you think of in the morning. And your ancestors and my ancestors did a good job with this, because we get to be here. We're missing a bunch of people in this room whose ancestors weren't so good, right? They weren't compulsive or perseverating enough. But take those 2 behaviors and apply them to addiction. Not so helpful. But those 2 behaviors are some of the definitions of addiction, because you really cannot stop thinking about it. It controls your life. So some of us are lucky or have genetics or epigenetics that give us baseline high dopamine levels. And if we all imagine our dopamine levels are sitting at about 100, some of us, and I'm going to say Sue Scott in that orange sweater, her dopamine levels are high. I know Sue. Her dopamine levels at a baseline are like at 110. She feels probably happy most days. She has a positive outlook on life. She's a glass half full kind of person. And there's a lot of us in this room that look a little bit more like this. And our baseline dopamine levels maybe 85 or 90. We don't get to control that. It's what we're given. We just have to work with it. But when you look at dopamine, if all of us are sitting normally at 100, when you find that perfect June 21st strawberry that tastes so delicious after eating those horrible strawberries from California that looked good and maybe even smelled good, but they have no flavor, and then June comes and Western Mass strawberries come, and you're like, wow, a strawberry has 27 flavors. You get a spike in dopamine. Because think about why that would work that way. You just went through a terrible hard winter living in a cave somewhere. You have not seen vitamin C or fiber in a long time. You want your brain to spike to 150 when you eat a perfect food. And that's what happens. We eat good food, our brain spikes to a dopamine level of 150. If you have sex, good consensual sex, good orgasm, your dopamine spikes to 200. It is supposed to be that way because you want that positive feedback so you can keep coming back for more. You use cocaine and your dopamine is going to spike to 350. If you use opiates or heroin, your dopamine is going to spike between 500 and 900. And if you use crystal methamphetamine, your dopamine will spike to between 12 and 1300. So those are some pretty high dopamine levels, right? So why is everybody in this room not using crystal meth right now? Never tried it. It's looking pretty good, isn't it, right? There is an answer. Did you say scared? Yeah, scared's fine. So there's an answer. We're going to get to it in like 3 slides. But we're going to talk about exactly how this works, okay? When we talk about dopamine, there's 3 variables. It's how much dopamine is made, how much dopamine is received on the other side, so how many dopamine receptors there are, and then how many dopamine reuptakes there are, how many little vacuums there are sucking dopamine out of the synaptic cleft. So 3 things matter with dopamine. How much is produced, how much is received, and how much gets sucked out of the synaptic cleft. And the way cocaine works is cocaine interacts with the dopamine reuptake, and it turns off the vacuum. So when the vacuum's not on, it's not sucking any dopamine out of the active spot in the synaptic cleft. So all that dopamine is just working at its 350 level for as long as you have that dopamine in there, which for coke maybe 2 or 3 hours. The way that heroin works is slightly more complicated because it goes through more pathways, but it interacts with an opiate receptor, which then interacts in a negative feedback loop with GABA. At the end of the day, the way that heroin and all opiates work is it pumps out more dopamine. So I said there were 3 things that control dopamine, and I've explained 2 drugs that impact 2 of the things. I can do this with everything. I can do it with marijuana, I can do it with sex or gambling. We can do it with every pathway with addiction. Some of the pathways get very complicated, and I start to not understand what happened really, but at the end of the day, it's influencing those 3 things. So the problem is, when the brain starts to see dopamine levels of 350 or 900 or 1200, it says, holy smokes, something is wrong here. Because for 200,000 years, we have existed in this form on this planet, and you should never have seen dopamine levels at that volume, ever. There's nothing in nature that gives you dopamine like that. And the brain says, there's something wrong here. We need to turn down the volume. It's too loud. I'm going to stop making dopamine. I'm going to get rid of my receptors. I'm going to cut them by 70%. And I'm going to increase my number of vacuums. I'm going to just suck all the dopamine out. That's what the brain's response is. So the answer to why are we doing this is because over time, the brain stops responding. And that first high you get with your first shot of heroin and you spike to 900, you never get to 900 again, right? It slowly starts to fall. And people are no longer chasing a high. They're no longer chasing trying to not feel drug sick. They are desperate to try to feel normal again. They're desperate to get back to a baseline of 85, which is maybe where they started, because they're not sitting at 85 anymore. Their new dopamine level is 40. It is hard to get out of bed. It is hard to take care of your kids. It is hard to show up to a job, take care of yourself. It's hard to make any good decisions when your baseline dopamine level is 40. So this is the reason we don't routinely use those drugs in this room, is because it is not sustainable. If this were sustainable and had no long-term impact on the brain, I think people would just keep doing it, and it would wreak havoc in some ways, but in other ways maybe it wouldn't. So it's a complicated reason. This is just a little chart that just shows you what a normal brain would do, is you have a nice normal level of 100, you have your orgasm, you spike to 200, and then you return to 100, right? You return to your baseline. And with the brain with addiction, it doesn't take long for this to happen. It could take a few weeks, it may take a month or two for some people. They never get back to their baseline, and in fact, their baseline becomes a new baseline that's very low and is not sustainable with a functional life. So I think of it as a broken brain. And the thing about a broken brain, like a broken leg, it gets better. It takes a long time to get better, but people can get better with this disease. But the days of us thinking about this as a moral weakness or a failing or bad parenting or bad genetics, we have got to move past that now because that's ridiculous. Those days when people would take people with mental illness and lock them up and do lobotomies and all kinds of other things, we would look at those days and get chills running up our arms thinking about those days, right? Think how far we've come with acknowledging anxiety, depression, bipolar illness, a variety of mental health illnesses that affect all of our families. Like, who doesn't have a family? I'm going to put my hand down. Who doesn't have a family with some mental health issues? Right? Not me. I got plenty of them in my family, right? So we have a lot of people in our society who struggle with substance abuse, and we need to acknowledge it for what it is and get the right support and treatment for people and not pretend that they're just going to have to pick themselves up by the bootstraps and get over it. We're going to talk about diabetes for a second. So people who have a nice, normal, functioning endocrine system have a pancreas that makes insulin, and insulin attaches itself to a insulin receptor on a cell, and when the insulin receptor is activated, it sucks glucose into the cell. That's the way our bodies work for those of us who don't have diabetes. When you have type 1 diabetes, you don't make insulin, so there's nothing there to interact with that insulin receptor, and consequently, no glucose gets sucked in. And the way type 2 diabetes is there is insulin. The pancreas is working pretty well up to a point, but the insulin receptor is broken. So I've just described a disease that's very common, for which vast quantities of money is spent everywhere, all over the world. And this is a disease that has to do with a receptor or a transmitter that gets broken in the body, right? It's exactly what I just described for dopamine. It doesn't work any different. And you would have a hard time naming a disease, other than infectious disease, which works differently. Every disease in our body that has to do with an organ has to do with a disruption in a messaging system. You know, different chemicals, different electrolytes, but it's a disruption in the messaging system. So when you look at a brain of somebody who's struggling with addiction, that brain on the left, these are PET scans, and if you Google PET scans, all of these things pop up, but that brain on the left is a brain of a healthy brain, a healthy person not struggling with addiction, and they have lots of dopamine. All of that orange is dopamine in the brain. And you look on the right side, that's somebody who's struggling with addiction, they just have no dopamine going on. They're sitting at 40, they can barely get out of bed, and they are desperate to return to their baseline of 85 or 100 just to feel normal again. They're going to keep using it. When you go drug by drug, that middle column is a healthy brain, so as you track your way down that middle column, there's lots of bright orange. And when you move over to the right column, that top one is a brain of somebody addicted to cocaine, the next one down is somebody addicted to methamphetamines, the third one down is somebody addicted to alcohol, and the final one is somebody addicted to heroin. And what you'll see is orange still lights up on alcohol. You can still see there's dopamine there. Alcohol is a complicated drug, it works through the GABA system. And people, this is one of the reasons why so many of us are functional alcoholics, is you can get by, you can scrape by, going to work, still trying to keep your marriage together, with your alcoholism, never coming to the doctor. No one ever walks into my office ever and says to me, you know what, I know I'm here to talk about my blood pressure, but I think I'm drinking too much and I need help, right? I have to screen them really hard and be effective and actually think they want to tell me about their problem today. Nobody ever asks for help with alcohol. But the truth is, about 10% of us struggle with alcohol, right? And it's really under-recognized. And it's only when the wheels fall off the bus and you've gotten your second OUI and you've lost your license and consequently lost your job and your wife has walked out on you that things really fall apart for you. It shouldn't have to get to that point. Yeah?
So I'm wondering, so the 900 dopamine shoots down to a baseline of 45. So the next time the person was heroin, I thought it would go back to 900, or it would go to 85 and so they feel okay. Do they ever get that?
So the next time that they get high, they're going to get a spike again, right? They're going to keep getting spikes for quite a while. But they'll never get a 900 again. Maybe they'll get an 872 and then an 869. It keeps decreasing. Everybody, when you talk to people struggling with addiction, boy, they have such fond memories of those first highs. And they'll talk about them in these really loving ways. I have a kid who's 25 now. He's just a great guy, really successful. But he started using when he was 16. And in those first years I took care of him, he will say to me, the best month of my life happened to me when I was 16 years old. And it will never be better than that. And I just remember sitting with him when he was 22 and looking at him thinking, that is the saddest thing I've ever heard. Like, how can you think the best month of your life has already happened? And I think he wouldn't say that now, but he was still in the throes of his early recovery, and he longed for that amazing month where he was sitting at 900 and 850, because it was so good. It was so good. I mean, those numbers are crazy. That is 5 or 6 times what the best orgasm gives you. That's pretty good numbers. So, did you say this about the cards? Are we passing around cards? Oh, so Ruth here has index cards, I think, and I'm happy. I don't care about getting interrupted. I'll answer questions in the middle. I've done this talk enough, I can remember where I am. So I'm happy to take questions in the middle, but if you kind of either don't want to be identified, Ruth is going to pass around index cards and you write down a question, and that way I can speak them aloud, which is what I forgot to do. I'm supposed to speak questions aloud so they can get recorded. So, but if you have a question or you think I just said something crazy, just stick your hand up. I'm happy to answer it. So the reason we're here today is one, so that we have a better community understanding of addiction, but two, is to acknowledge who might get in trouble, okay? Because not every one of us is likely to develop an addiction. I would say 90% of us don't have an addiction, or a little bit less than that, but most of us don't get an addiction, which means most of us could probably go out and use some heroin and be okay. I'm not advocating that. I think it's a risky decision. But there are some people who are going to be higher risk in general. And the way that we can look at this is to acknowledge that genetics, early exposure, and a history of trauma are the 3 biggest predictors for who's going to struggle with addiction. I'm going to take a sip of my Diet Coke, to which I am not addicted, but I got to this. So let's talk about the genetics part of this. So the genetics plays a huge role in addiction. And the reason I spend time talking to people in this room, some of whom are parents or teachers, is because we have to be able to recognize that of all the diseases out there, addiction is one of the most genetically linked ones. So a lot of people walk into my office and they start telling me their genetic cancer risk. You know, my great aunt had breast cancer, and then I'm trying not to actively roll my eyes. Internally, I'm rolling my eyes because there's very few cancers, truly, that are very strong genetically linked. I mean, there's some colon cancers that have some very strong genetics behind them. But the truth is, most women who get breast cancer, there's no genetic risk. There's some, you know, the BRCA gene, a handful of those. But so many people live in fear because they have a family history of cancer that everybody that they have ahead of them in the future will have cancer. The way the genetics works on addiction is that if you have a parent with addiction, you have a 50% chance of having an addiction yourself. 50%, that is a big number. And you know who needs to know that? Your kids need to know that. Because if you had a really strong family history of cancer, you think your kids wouldn't know that? It's not rational, but they would know that. So this is a hard thing for parents to hear me say. But you've got to start telling your kids the truth about what's going on in your family. Now, we're not talking great aunts here, but parents or grandparents or siblings, they need to know it puts them at higher risk. And addiction is addiction to anything. It could be to nicotine or alcohol. It's not just that your dad shot heroin. And even people in recovery, the genetics don't change even though you're in recovery, right? The genetics are still there. Your kids deserve to know that because they have an opportunity to really influence the next slide that we're going to talk about. And they can make a choice differently. So there's a question for you.
Yes. How far down the generations does it go? For instance, grandchildren.
So it definitely goes to grandchildren. So I said parents and parents and grandparents. What often happens in families is it will skip a generation, not because the genetics skip, but because when you ask somebody, so in the average doctor's office, what's supposed to happen in all of our good offices is you're supposed to say, tell me about your relationship with alcohol. That should be asked of all of us when we walk in for our physical, because it really matters. And I know that no one's going to tell me about their relationship with alcohol and admit they have a problem unless I dig a little bit, right? And people will say, and we're going to show a slide, people will say, I don't drink. And my next question, I shouldn't just blow by and think, ooh, I just saved 10 seconds. I should stop and say, why don't you drink? Because the answer to that question really matters. Sometimes they'll say, I don't drink because I am an alcoholic. Now, I didn't know that, right? Like, I forgot that part, or I never heard that part. Or they'll say, I don't drink because my mom was a drop-down drunk and I couldn't stand thinking I was going to be like her. Many of us make an active choice to veer away from what we see our parents doing. But then the genetics are still passed on to the grandchildren, so it still matters. So I would go back 2 generations is my answer to your question. So the genetics matter and your kids need to know it. There's my first strong position statement. The second thing is this, which is early exposure to a substance is what defines addiction. That addiction is a pediatric developmental disease. And I'm going to say, sometimes I say these statements and I think, oh my God, that's not even that. But if you have not used a substance by the age of 24 or 25, you will never develop an addiction. You just won't. You have to be exposed to a substance while the brain is still developing. And the substance, it can be anything, right? It could be nicotine, or alcohol, or marijuana, or, somebody's Vicodin that was left over, right? But it happens while the brain is still developing. Now, I'm not saying 12-year-olds are shooting heroin. They're not. In general, they're not. But they're often starting somewhere. And when you sit down with somebody who's struggling with an addiction of any sort, and you say, tell me what your first drug abuse was, and how old were you? And I always throw out the easy ones. I always say, was it marijuana, alcohol, or cigarettes? Because those are the three most common in our society. And they'll say, I started stealing my parents' cigarettes when I was whatever age. I often will hear 11, 12, or 13. Those are common ages. But I gave this exact talk to the jail, and I gave it at the jail in Springfield. And in the room, I have 120 men and women who have been incarcerated for their disease of addiction. And I asked that question. Everybody in the room, what was your first age of use? And I gave out the three easy ones. Who started at 12? Every hand is in the room at 12. I think we would have predicted that, right? I don't know. I take care of those guys, and they're very familiar to me. And then I started to count down. Who was at 11? 10? 9? My heart's sinking. I hit 9, and I start to feel sick, right? 8? There's still hands in the air. 7? 6. It is not until I hear 6 that the final hand, I'm left with one gentleman in the room with his hand up at the age of 6. Now, I don't know what you think happens that a 6-year-old can do, but the notion of lighting a match or opening a bottle, I felt sick. But every one of those men had started their substances before the age of 12, and really at 8 or 9. Now, I'm not saying that you should fear for your third graders, right? But we have to acknowledge that kids have access to things, right? And back in the day, right, for those of us, first of all, things have changed, right? Smoking, we have the lowest smoking rates, and we're going to show some slides of this, that we've ever had in history of this country, which is a huge victory, right? But think about your grandparents' generation. People had packs of cigarettes lying around all over the house, right? Think about who smoked generations back in your family. And there'd be cartons lying about, and you think an 8-year-old couldn't take those? Of course they could. These days, it's actually really hard to get cigarettes, as it should be, right? But I want you to pause and ask yourself about the alcohol in your house. Where's your alcohol? Is it under lock and key? Well, that's an amazing number of head nods. That's what I will say. I rarely see this many heads nod. And if it's not under lock and key, and you have kids in your house, I want you to ask yourself, how easy is their access? Because I went to high school in this local area in the 80s, and I can tell you where we got our alcohol from. It was from our parents' liquor cabinet, right? And we all drank it, we filled it up with water, and sometimes we were smart enough to put some color in it, but usually we just filled it up with water, right? Everybody else? Was I the only one? Okay, I can tell you my husband did that crazy too. My point is if you want your kids to access drugs or alcohol, just leave it out in the open for them, which is what your alcohol is today. Okay? So the point of this is that early use is one of the defining characteristics of somebody who might develop an addiction. Now, for all of us who did drink, smoke, or do something in our teenage years, not all of us became addicted. Of course, I recognize that. But when you start piling these things on top of each other, a genetic risk, early exposure, and then this final one we're going to head into, you've got to think to yourself, if you were a kid who knew you have a very strong genetic predisposition to addiction based on what your dad told you, you would be the kind of kid who says, you know what, I'm not going to go to that after-prom drinking party when I'm 15. I'm not going to do it. I know I'm higher risk, so I'm going to avoid early exposure as long as I can. I may be the kind of person who has my first drink at the age of 19 or 21. I know that sounds absolutely insane, but guess what? Our kids are making better and better decisions, and we need to support them and also recognize that actually that group of kids defines the norm. They really do. And wouldn't it be great if those were the cool kids? Wouldn't it be great if your job showing up at a frat party when you're a freshman was actually to make sure every person at that party was safe? That none of those girls got hauled up the stairs, that the boys are, my opinion, are equally victims there too, because they all rape under the influence of drugs and alcohol, right? Wouldn't that be great if we had this whole army of kids who showed up at these parties who weren't drinking? Really? You should avoid all substances as long as can. We're going to dive in on marijuana, because I feel pretty strongly on that one. Okay, so this is just one example here. If you start drinking, and drinking here is defined as 2 drinks a week at the age of 15. 2 drinks a week, not a 6-pack, just 2 drinks. At the age of 15, 40% of those kids go on to be alcoholics. If you wait till you're 21, 7%. So delay the use. I'm not saying just say no. I think the Just Say No campaign did not work. We have to acknowledge it makes you feel awesome, right? And it takes away the pain, and it numbs you up. It does all these things. It makes you more socially capable. I'm so funny if I'm in a crowd, if I've had some beer, right? We have to acknowledge to our kids it does those things, but it does it in a way that puts you at risk for addiction, but also puts you at risk for just terrible decision making. So Ruth covered this already, which was really nice. The number one drugs that are abused in our society today are marijuana, right? That's number one. It is so far off this chart that this bar graph doesn't even really work because it's 35%, which would go off the slide. And then the second most common drug abused are just the stimulants. Kids trade a lot of stimulants. Heroin and opiates are pretty low on the list. That's a good thing. We would like that to be the case. What we know about marijuana is that marijuana use has increased as nicotine has gone down. And nicotine rates are the lowest that they've been among high school seniors. But as the sense of harm goes down, as sense of risk goes down, use goes up. That is true for all substances. And if you ask the average 15 or 17-year-old about marijuana, what do they say to you? Anybody ask anybody recently?
What
was that?
It should be legal and it's no big deal.
It should be legal. In fact, it is legal and it's no big deal. That's exactly right. Anything else you hear? It's not addictive. Nope, not addictive. Yep. It's natural. It grows from the ground. I can plant it myself, and I do. Yep. Anybody else?
You did it.
What was that? You did it. You did it. And what did you say? Who does it all the time? My family's doing it all the time. I'm surrounded by it. You did it, and everybody around me is doing it. Yeah, absolutely. So it's very normalized, right? The use of marijuana amongst our 15 to 25, it's not just normalized, it's really celebrated. I had a guy today in the office, and he's a really smart guy, but he was spending the entire time telling me, you know, it cures everything. It cures all diseases. It cures cancer. And then he went to this new shtick, which one of my great residents was with me, and I hadn't even talked to him about it, but he went this new thing, well, it really is the environmental solution to all ailments of the world. I hadn't heard him do that one before, but I hear a lot of adolescents do that. Like, you can make clothes out of it, you can make plastic out of it. I mean, like, the sell on marijuana these days is really intense. So let's talk about marijuana a tiny bit. So first I'm going to say there's very poor studies on marijuana, right? Terrible. In this country, terrible. Like, there's no good data, there's no good studies, it's all crap that's out there. And why is that? Because in this country you cannot use federal funds to study an illegal drug. You can use, maybe if you really worked it really hard, you can use federal funds to study the federally grown marijuana that's grown on some field in Alabama, but that's not marijuana that anybody's using, right? Like, you need to study what today's youth are using, you need to study what's happening at the dispensary in Northampton. That's the stuff you want to study. And the problem with marijuana is it's not one drug. It's as many varieties or strains of marijuana as being grown. Like, you need to study every different variant of the THC to cannabinoid ratio. And then there's tons of other chemicals in there I can't even pronounce. You'd have to study all of those. And you'd have to study them in all the forms that they could enter into the body, which is a lot right now, right? So it's a complicated study to do, and you have no money to do it because you didn't get your federal funding. Who's going to do this study? So 2 countries do this study well, do study marijuana well, and they are Australia and New Zealand. So the next things I'm going to show you happen to come from Australia and New Zealand. This one up here is a study from Australia that looked at teenagers who started using marijuana when they were 15, 16, or 17, and it followed them for 20 or 30 years. And it measured what their lives were like and their IQs were between the ages of 35 and 45. So pretty good long-term study. And it showed an 8-point drop in IQ at the age of 35 when you started using marijuana in high school. That is not an insignificant drop in IQ. 8 points is a big drop. That's like getting into grad school or not getting into grad school. This study that then came out of New Zealand looked at graduation rates for people who start, and this is starting pretty early, this is starting at 14, but I tell you, if you actually ask people, they start using marijuana very early. And so the dropout rates are significantly higher for those who use marijuana starting at 14 or younger, and then the percent of people entering into college. So it has an impact on cognition without a doubt. And one of the things I will say to the response that somebody in the mid said of, you used to do it, is I tell you what the rest of us may have smoked in the 80s and 90s is not even remotely similar to what is available today, right? I mean, the stuff that is available today, in comparison, the stuff that maybe people used was maybe 2%, 3% THC. It is now routinely 12, 15, 20%, and then depending on how you actually get it into your body, it can be as high as 50 to 70% THC. This is a completely unfamiliar chemical, right? It is completely different than anything that maybe anybody in the 70s and 80s and 90s were using. And if I asked everybody, a teenager, what this was, they could tell me. If I showed them a big fat rolled joint, they'd be like, I don't even know what that thing is, right? The way that this drug is ingested into the body is completely different. Has anybody ever gone to the marijuana dispensary or just to a vape shop? Just checked out the goods? Anybody been to a vape shop? You've been, yeah. I mean, did you know how to use everything in there? Or was it very familiar? I walked in, I was like, I feel like I'm on another planet. I didn't recognize the equipment. It was like really beautifully glass blown, expensive, really expensive equipment. But I'll tell you, today's 17-year-olds and 21-year-olds, they know how to use all of this. This is all different forms of marijuana that you can find in Colorado right now. That one on the bottom that looks like earwax is sometimes called earwax. It's also called dab, and that is 70% THC. And that is the one that if you take a marijuana plant and you force butane through it, and then your house accidentally explodes. That happened nearby. Hadley? Was it Hadley? Hatfield? It was really recent. Last couple of months there was a house. South Hadley? Thank you. So in Colorado, the burn units are filled with victims of trying to make this product here. Right? Huge public health expense when you have people filling burn units. This is my real issue with marijuana. I mean, I could talk about the fact that I don't think it's good for the developing brain. And at the end of the day, I actually don't care if an adult uses marijuana. I honestly don't care. I really care if somebody under the age of 24 is exposing themselves to high THC on a routine basis. Because today's teenagers are not smoking once a month. Right? For those of us who take care of them, I wake up every morning, I take a hit, and then I smoke it at lunch. I vape it in the bathroom at school because nobody knows because they can't smell it. I use it at night, it helps me sleep. I have anxiety, it helps me with everything, it cures cancer. They use it all day long with THC levels of that. You think that isn't going to have an impact? And when they look at the addiction rates of people who start in their teenage years, the addiction rate for marijuana is 30 to 40%. That's a high number. Right? The addiction rate in general, when you start as an adult, is about 9%, but it has to do with the developing brain, which everybody in this room already knew. And if you think this is not a giant money-making scheme for big tobacco, who has lost a lot of their money, right? If you think this is not a multi-billion-dollar industry walking into Massachusetts, making a lot of money on adding yet another substance into our teenage brains, then I got a bridge to sell you somewhere. Because if you look at this stuff that's being sold in Colorado right now, and you think that's not marketed to children and teenagers, gummy bears, you show me somebody who has AIDS cachexia, who has their medical marijuana certificate, who's eating a gummy bear, right? This is marketed to teenagers. Nutella, Pop-Tarts, and what is this stuff? Has anybody been to Colorado yet? Just as a... You guys in the corner, you guys are traveling. And did you walk in there and you saw things like this?
I used to live there.
Have you lived there since marijuana became legal?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of people actually don't go to the dispensaries that sell these things because doing that is expensive.
So people just grow it themselves and do it their own way?
They still buy it off the streets because MMJ, medical marijuana, you have to, go to things that people can't afford, like doctors.
Yeah. So that is certainly the case, that this stuff is not inexpensive. It just gets certified for medical marijuana in this state because it costs money. So my point here is that this is targeted. We've always used to be able to say that no one has ever died from marijuana. And teenagers will say this line to me. They'll say, it's not worse than alcohol. It's probably better than alcohol. I actually don't disagree with them about that. But that's because I think alcohol is pretty harmful to society. And it's not like I'm perfect. I drink, right? Like, I am so not a perfect person, but I have a lot of cognition about why I drink and when I drink. And my point is that you are a lot of harm has come to a lot of us in society from alcohol. The line that teenagers always throw at me is no one has ever died from marijuana, but we have 2 deaths now in Colorado of kids who died ingesting marijuana because they ate gummy bears, right? It's not intended for kids, but they get their hands on them and then they die. So anyway, it's on the ballot, right? Coming up November on the ballot. There's a really good speaker who's going to be at Mount Holyoke on March 30th. She's a Harvard investigator who researches this stuff all the time. She knows way more than I do. I think she's supposed to be a great speaker. It's open to the public. So you guys will get that out to people who want to know more about that. So let's go back to the great things that most of our teenagers are doing. We have the lowest rates of nicotine use in history. It's down to 5.3% of high school seniors are using tobacco. That is amazing. Tobacco, paper tobacco. What we have to acknowledge though is e-cigarettes and vaping nicotine has increased. In some school districts, like 60% of the seniors have tried an electronic cigarette.
And that's gone up.
It has gone up. So your local measurements say that it's gone up, and you have that on the board out there. And so that's one of the worries that you all have, and that's because, does anybody, just you walk into a gas station, and those e-cigarettes are right there in front of you, right? And they're like watermelon bubblegum flavor, and they're like a little glitter pets. You think the truckers are buying those? The truckers aren't buying those. Kids are buying those. So the e-cigarette use has gone up, and when and if this ever gets regulated, because if you ask the average teenager, this is the Monitoring the Future survey that comes out of the University of Michigan, and most teenagers will say, I just use the flavor, I don't use the nicotine ones. But this is a completely unregulated industry. There could be nicotine in any of those things. No one knows. Nobody's supervising these people. So when and if these drugs get pulled from the market, we're left with a generation truly with a nicotine addiction. What are they going to do? They're going to go back to paper cigarettes. And they're going to realize how expensive they are. My point is that there's no benefit in having this stuff in a teenage brain. Like, they should not be vaping anything. So I want to talk about us, who are parents in this room, and I already covered some of this with my little rant earlier, but we have a huge impact on our kids. And when you look at how we all drink, a third of us in this country drink nothing, zero. And a third of us in this country drink a little bit, a couple drinks maybe a month, a couple drinks a year, not much at all, but some people will describe as a light social drinker. And the final 1/3 of us drink all the rest of the alcohol, and in fact the final 10% of us drink on average 7 to 10 drinks a day. So I don't know who in this room is going to go home and have their 7 to 10 drinks, but it's going to be likely 10% of us will. And people always shake their heads and say, that's not possible. And I say, oh yes it is. Because when you actually ask somebody, what's your relationship to alcohol? And they answer to me, oh, I don't know, I have a couple drinks a night. And I said, tell me what you're drinking, wine, beer? Well, I have wine, okay? And I say, well, what's in a glass? Because we all know what glasses of wine look like these days, right? And they're not your grandmother's 1964 wedding wine glasses. They're these giant goblets, right? They're like mason jars on a stem. And when you measure what a glass of wine is, it is supposed to be 5 ounces. Now, everybody needs to go home tonight or tomorrow, and I want you to put 5 ounces of whatever you want in your wine glass. And just acknowledge that that is a drink. And if you're pouring a full glass, you just need to acknowledge you're pouring 3 drinks. Because when I ask women, women is this category of individuals who've increased their alcohol intake in the last 15 to 20 years, unlike anything we have ever seen before. Alcoholism used to be a man's disease. It was like a 9-to-1 ratio between men and women. That is no longer the case. The ratios are closer to like 6 to 3, or maybe even shifting more than that. And one of the reasons is this: women are marketed alcohol, right? Your lives are hard, you work full time, you've been up since 5, you come home after work, the house is a wreck, no one walked the dog, the breakfast dishes are still on the counter, and you're ticked off, right? That's how I walk in my house every single night. And I found myself leaving work thinking, wow, I had a hard day at work, I can't wait to have a drink. And I thought that for about 2 weeks, and then I thought, oh my God, what am I thinking I can't wait to have a drink, right? Because what was I doing? I was self-medicating for stress, walking in the house, the model that we all have as parents of walking in the house and saying, man, I had a terrible day, and then glug, 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 glug. You think your kids don't see you do that? You think that those of us who walk in the room, pop open a bottle of beer before we've even like kissed our kids on the cheek, like that happens every single night in East Hampton and Greenfield and all across our country. And what we model is, I've had a terrible day, I'm stressed out, I want to feel something different than I feel right now, I'm going to have a drink. And what if you walked into the room and said, I've had such a terrible day, will you go for a walk with me? I've had such a terrible day, I'm going to go stand in tree pose in the living room, you want to come? Right? Aren't there 1,000 healthy things we can do to actually feel better that doesn't involve this? Because when I ask women in my office, I can't tell you how often, it happens now twice a week, that I discover a fairly young professional woman like myself who's really developed an incredibly unhealthy relationship with alcohol. And she's really drinking 7 to 10 wines a night, right? Closer to a bottle, and she'll finally admit that to me. And she's doing it to self-medicate for stress, for worry, it helps her sleep. It doesn't help sleep, it makes sleep worse. So I need everybody in this room to sort of self-acknowledge where you are and ask yourself, is there a change that you want to make? And what do your kids see of you? Okay, remember it's a long time ago, I said there are 3 things that influence who might get addicted. The first one was genetics, the second one was early exposure, and the final one was trauma. And this is going to feel like I'm way off in left field here, but I want to spend some time talking about this because this doesn't get talked about enough. So in 2007, a study came out of Kaiser on the West Coast, out of San Diego County. And this study is called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACE study. And there was a guy there who had surveyed a whole bunch of people. I think the end of the survey was 17,000 people. And he was trying to study childhood obesity. He was trying to figure out why some of our kids get really fat, some of us don't. And he put together 10 questions that reflected what might have happened to you under the age of 18. And he put it out to these 17,000 people, they responded, and then he compared them to Kaiser's population overall. So I'm not going to read every question, but I'm going to whip through some of these questions so you have a sense of what was asked. Did a parent or another adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you? Ever hit you so hard that you had marks or you were injured? Were you ever sexually abused? Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? That your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you? Your parents were too drunk or too high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if needed. The questions go on. Were your parents separated or divorced? Was anybody in your family diagnosed with major mental illness? Was anybody in your family incarcerated? And what these questions measured is 3 things. It measured abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. That was the intent of the study, is to measure these things. And what they didn't know about this study is that this became a marker for actually increased risk, significantly increased risk of all kinds of diseases. Asthma, COPD, heart attacks, early death. I'm sorry, what? What does all of that have to do with that, right? They didn't predict any of that. It specifically had a very high prediction rate for people who would struggle with chronic pain, the diagnosis of chronic pain, I can't get out of pain, and people who would develop an addiction. And I want you to pause for a minute and ask yourself, what is this all about, right? Because I can tell you the next 20 to 30 years of psychology, social work, and medicine is going to be focused on this. If you could think about yourself as an individual living on this planet 1,000 years ago, your fight or flight stress response increased a handful of times, maybe a handful of times a week, depending on where you were living. But you're being chased by a bear somewhere, right? And you spike your cortisol, you spike your adrenaline, you run as fast as you can to safety, and you have adrenaline levels that are high for what, an hour maybe, an hour and a half if things are really going wrong? They go back to normal. You found safety, you curled up under your rock, you hugged your kids, you were safe, right? When you are a 7-year-old or a 5-year-old living in a household where you don't know where your next meal is coming from, where you're watching your sister be sexually assaulted by your older brother, where you are worried every day when you come home from school if you're going to find your mother dead in the bathroom from a heroin overdose. When you are growing up in those situations, your cortisol levels are high, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for a decade. And if you think having levels of cortisol in your brain, as your brain is developing, at those high levels is healthy for any cell in your body to develop, you're wrong, right? It's terribly unhealthy. And it creates individuals who are just more ill. They are predictably sicker people. And if every ounce of what we can do as a society is to help prevent this from happening to our children, we will have made a bigger difference in overall public health than anything else on this planet. Anything. And you know what? We don't talk about this stuff enough. We talk about child abuse. I know that we do. We talk about it in schools. But in this room, for those of you who are teachers or school nurses or who work with kids on a daily basis, you know what these numbers look like. You can score kids on their ACE scores. I know you can do that. It has a huge impact. And we need more of our people in our community to understand this stuff, and we need more resources going to help kids with a history of trauma, right? Because you want to not feel that pain anymore, start drinking or use a pill. There's no faster way to numb up that pain than that. And when you talk to people with a history of addiction, and I survey all my people with an ACE score and I take care of them, their numbers are astronomical. I sit in the room and I just weep with them because I'm horrified that this happened. And I can't change it for them, I acknowledge that, but I acknowledge it with them, and I say it wasn't your fault, it should never have happened to you. And oftentimes it's the first time anybody's talking to them about this. It's the first time somebody's really getting real about why it is they became an addict. Because the truth is, if my ACE score is a 1, I've had a glorious life. But for those of you in this room who haven't, or people who haven't, boy, it's really easy to shut it all down and turn to drugs. The underlying cause of a lot of addiction is a history of trauma, and we've got to start treating it that way. So anyway, if you want to spend late at night with nothing better to do, I tell you, just Google ACE scores. It is everywhere now. There are TED Talks on it. The CDC is devoting a huge amount of research money. If you're a student, you should go into this stuff, because this is like the next frontier. It's really interesting. Okay, so we did it. We covered this basic stuff. My final message on this front before I switch to something slightly different is talk early. 5th grade is not too early to be talking to your kids. A kindergartner should know if you find a pill, you get an adult. You don't touch it, you don't eat it, right? That's kindergarten level lesson or earlier. You get an adult rapidly. 5th grade, right? What's a 5th grader? How old's a 5th grader? 10, right? I said to you, I have 6-year-olds who are using alcohol and tobacco, right? So a 10-year-old needs to have early discussions about what this looks like. And certainly by the time they're in 7th and 8th grade, they should know their genetic history. They really should. That's my attitude. I sit down with all my kids, I go over our genetics, I know where their risk factors are, and I urge them that they need to be people who are going to avoid it, because I've got strong family history. And the other thing I want to say about our students is that they can't control their genetics, and they can't control their trauma. And if we can give them the guidance, we can help them make better decisions about use. Because I find that teenagers make better decisions when they're informed. Okay, so again, about this subject here. So this question says, is there a link between the trigger that causes the child to choose drugs the first time? Does the recovery process involve addressing the initial triggering episode? So that is, a lot of that stuff, I would say, if I'm reading this question correctly, has to do with trying to quiet down fear, trauma, sadness, loss, right? And so, what doesn't happen, does anybody work in the recovery world in this room? Can you just tell me, like, what sort of settings you work in? You're a psychologist. You work with individual patients one-on-one. In specialized in addiction too? Okay, good. In the back there? In trauma? Okay, so here's like somebody in this room who really knows this stuff inside out. Lovely. What do you do in recovery?
Correctional facility.
Correctional facility, excellent. Okay. So I would say by and large, most of our treatment places do nothing that's trauma-informed, nothing. I mean, I actually think if you went to the average treatment place and said any of this, I do this talk all the time, and I'm in rooms sometimes, not of those of us who are just average people, but I'm in rooms of people who are treatment people, and run treatment facilities. And I'm like, let's talk about the ACE score, like who's read the study, who uses it on a daily basis, and I have one hand going up in the room. And I'm not saying that's the only trauma thing out there, but it's really, from an American medicine standpoint, it's one of the best studies ever done. And I got one person in the room who's never even heard of it, and whoever spends a single moment thinking about what trauma does to our kids' brains and why it is you would want to feel differently. So I hope I'm sort of answering this. There is a very strong link between the trigger, and we have to actually address the trigger, which for many people is the history of trauma. And if you don't know your ACE score, I tell you, I think everybody should know their ACE score. I really do. Now, having said that, this is not a tool that should be used on kids, right? The way this survey was used, it was given to adults who said, tell me what happened to you under the age of 18. So this is not a tool that should be rolled out in schools. Like, it doesn't have that purpose, although there are some kinds of these that we could use in schools. Mentally, as a teacher, as a therapist, as a doctor, I can score kids. Like, I know a lot, but I'm missing. I know I'm missing, right? I'm missing all kinds of their numbers that I just don't know. I don't know about the sexual assault, but I need to get to that place. But acknowledging that, we're doing a great training for teachers and superintendents in Greenfield, showing a movie called Paper Tigers. I'd like you to come. Like, actually, the whole East Hampton Coalition come. It's going to be in April, but Paper Tigers is actually a trauma-informed high school that started in Washington State? I made that part up, somewhere in the Northwest.
Yeah.
And, right, Washington State?
Walla Walla.
Walla Walla, right? And it's this whole high school that takes the most traumatized people. And, I mean, I'm torturing you here because I'm actually talking way more on this subject than I should, but when you look at what happens to kids in classrooms with a history of trauma, they tend to be really reactive, like way out of proportion reactive. They tend to be very distractible, poor attention spans, lots of physical movement. They tend to be quite depressed. They like to sort of self-isolate and remove. I mean, I don't know, what psych diagnoses look like that? There's a lot of ADD out there that gets called ADD. That may not be ADD at all, right? It's a history of trauma, right? But nobody's addressing that. Instead, we just medicate them more. Are we really doing, what was that? Just give them a lot more Ritalin, right? And are we doing a service to our kids? When you look at the there's a whole website for those of you who are educators on ACE scores in education. I think that website is ACE scores matter or something, and it looks at graduation rates. Once you get an ACE score higher than 4, the likelihood of you graduating high school dramatically drops. Missing numbers of days of schools, getting suspended. They're able to measure all of these things based on your ACE scores. It's what you would predict sort of innately in yourself, like kids who come from these homes where nothing good has happened to them. How are they going to succeed? Right? But it's for those of you who are educators, it's worth knowing that stuff. But again, don't roll this out in your health class. Not at this level. You're not ready for that. None of us will be ready for that. Okay, ready? We're switching topics. We are going to what people thought they came to hear me talk about. And we're going to just talk about opiates in general. So this was the paper for me. I live and work in Franklin County, and this is the Greenfield Reporter. In the top left picture is a young woman named Ashley Sims. And every morning I get up and I make my coffee and I get the paper and I read the obituaries first, which sounds like I'm a morbid person, but I'm a doctor who takes care of a lot of sick people, and I like to know who died this last night. I need to know that. I need to call families. Every morning is my ritual. And I got up that morning in December of 2012 and I read Ashley Sims, age 21, died of a heroin overdose at home. And I thought, oh my God, I know Ashley. I know her grandmothers. And I called them right away and expressed my sadness. And I said, I'm so grateful you told the truth about Ashley's death. I am so glad you told us how she died. Because for months I've been reading young people who died at home, unexpected death at home. And right, there's only 2 reasons you die unexpectedly at home. It's either suicide or it's an overdose. Unless it says, please make contributions to the Dana-Farber Cancer Society. Unless it feels to you like they're a young kid who had cancer. These days, if they're young and died in an unanticipated way, I presume it's a suicide or it's an overdose. And I'm so grateful to these brave grandmothers who told the truth and then went to the paper and said, please do not let her death go in vain. You need to tell the story, what's happening in our community. And the paper did a great job. They ran series, it's on the front page of the paper all the time. The level of knowledge in our communities, the level of knowledge that our local journalists are giving to the subject is extraordinary. I mean, we have a reporter here and a news camera here because people are trying to get the word out, right? We don't want people suffering alone anymore. People need to talk about this. This is the reason we're here tonight. So, front page of Time magazine last summer was pills are on the hook for this current heroin epidemic. And no one denies that. I'm not going to dispute that at all. There is also no doubt in my mind that we are actually in the midst of the worst public health crisis that was brought to you by the American medical system. It is very hard for me to think of anything else that American medicine got this wrong. And I think about it all the time. I'm constantly trying to find some equivalent. Like lobotomies, I mentioned that one, that was bad. The eugenics movement, bad. Tuskegee experiments, bad, right? But it didn't affect this many people, right? We didn't have, whatever the number is now, 74 Americans dying of a heroin or opiate overdose every single day because I did a bad job 15 and 10 years ago. So let's talk about how all this unfolded. I trained in the 1990s and went to my residency at Boston University in the 1990s. And it was at the time where pain was the 5th vital sign. Who's in healthcare here? Who pain is the 5th vital sign, familiar sounding, right? And it was huge. It was huge. It was everywhere. It really mattered. You were going to lose your licensure. JACO was coming to visit. The surveys out of the ER said you were doing a terrible job because you weren't managing pain. I had all my meals paid for me by Purdue Pharma because I was a starving resident who worked like 130 hours a week, and they came to my hospital and fed me breakfast and lunch. And they said to me, they would say, look, you can use 120 milligrams of OxyContin. You can use it twice, sometimes 3 times a day. It helps with migraines, fibromyalgia, osteoarthritis. You can just use it. It's fine. It's not addictive. It's fine. And so guess what I did? I was an intern. I had my first prescription pad. It was in my white coat pocket all the time. You think I didn't write Oxy's prescription? Of course I did. They told me it was fine. What did I know? Nothing. And after a year working in the South Boston Community Health Center of writing scripts that were more than anybody should have written, I wasn't the only one. I would watch these young people come in who were clearly addicted and struggling, and I was like, holy smokes, something is going wrong here, and we all stopped writing. So it was a bad year in South Boston. It was, for those of you who remember what was happening in South Boston in the 1990s, it was bad. But my point is, for those of us on the ground living this world, we saw it all unfold before our eyes, and this pain is the fifth vital sign is based on two things. The evidence for it was based on a letter to the editor that was submitted to the New England Journal in 1980 that said less than 1% of people will get addicted to opiates when prescribed them for chronic use. So a letter to the editor, which I can't even find, it's on like microfiche, and I don't have time to go back to find microfiche, right? And this study here, which is based on 38 patients who were given opiates for a chronic period of time. Chronic here was defined as between 8 months and I think 4 years. And they were given opiates at fairly low levels compared to today's standards for fibromyalgia and migraines and osteoarthritis, non-cancer pain. 38 patients. Is that a big study? No. 38 patients. And a letter. Are the evidence behind the pain is the fifth vital sign. It was appalling. Right? And who was making money? Pharmaceuticals. They made billions of dollars off of this. And as we prescribe more opiates, more people die from opiate overdose, and more people enter treatment for opiate addiction. Right? A kindergartner could have drawn this graph in the 1990s. This was very predictable, based on what we know about what is very powerful medicine that needs to be written for people who struggle with both acute and sometimes with chronic pain, but it needs to be managed very carefully. It cannot be managed haphazardly. You can't be just writing scripts left and right for big volumes. You can't do that. At this point, half of all opiate prescriptions go for non-acute, non-cancerous pain. That's a lot. I think everybody who's ever heard D.A. Sullivan talk, he's great at talking about this stuff and he knows all the statistics on it, but 90% of all opiate prescriptions are written for the United States. Does that mean the United States has worse pain? No, it's because we live in a society, there's a pill for every ill, right? We live in a society that has terrible insurance, where really, the only thing you can get covered are prescriptions. And you can't get a massage or acupuncture, or you can't get away with not having a $25 copay for your physical therapy. Ask yourself in this room, if you had acute back pain right now, right, what would you do to help yourself? I mean, I know what I would do. I have a bank account that has enough money in it that I could order a massage tomorrow. I could go see an acupuncturist. I could make my co-payments for my physical therapy. I have a heating pad and electricity and ibuprofen, right? That's what I would do, not just because I'm worried about this, but because I have resources, right? But a lot of people who struggle with pain have nothing that they can really actualize. You remember one of the things I said, a history of trauma can be a predictor for chronic pain. So all my patients I take care of with chronic pain, I know their E-scores too. We spend a lot of time talking about it. Like, I need to get them more trauma-informed care. Yeah.
When you say that there wasn't, I always thought there was a problem on their medication.
So this is the question, are we under-medicating people in pain? So what we know, that was part of the pain is the fifth vital sign. We're doing a terrible job with people in pain.
That wasn't the fault.
No, I actually think a lot of people have chronic pain. I really do. The statistics, the Institute of Medicine would say that numbers 100,000 Americans live with chronic pain. The question is chronic, long-term, high-dose opiates the solution? Because that was the automatic jump. We have 100 million Americans living with chronic pain, so let's give them a lot of OxyContin. And instead, what if the jump had been, we have 100 million Americans living with chronic pain. Let's start chronic pain support groups. Let's get integrated behavioral health to get really good at some treatments that really are shown to work with this. Let's help people move. Let's actually build warm swimming pools in communities where people who live with chronic pain can sit and feel a little bit better. Let's have massage schools that poor people can get a massage. I know that seems like crazy stuff, but ask yourself what you do when you're in pain, right? Really? Am I the only one who does these other things, right? You try to do anything you can not to have it. Pain is horrible. And for those of us who live with chronic pain, it is mind-numbing. And I want to be clear, I am not a non-prescriber of medicine for people with chronic pain. It's just, I do not believe that opiates are the only answer. And my point on all of this is prescribe more opiates, prescribe more opiates, prescribe more opiates, because that's what we all did, right? We didn't get good at sort of saying, what else can I do to help you, right? That's what we didn't get good. These medicines get paid for, and pharmaceuticals were pushing it on us, right? The yoga community didn't have some lobby that showed up at my hospital. Okay. I I'm a public health person, I love this slide, so I have to show it to you. So this is a slide that looks at, in 10-year span of time, between 2000 and 2010, how we made an improvement or we got worse at disease that caused death. So at the bottom part of the slide, in the negative numbers, are places where we've made improvement. Fewer people have died from aortic aneurysms, from influenza and pneumonia. Why are few people dying of flu and pneumonia? Vaccines, right? Why are few people dying of aortic aneurysms? Blood pressure. It's both blood pressure and smoking cessation. People want to say it's screening. Screening has had a tiny impact on that. But so controlling blood pressure and getting people off their cigarettes will stop them from having aortic aneurysm. You decrease motor vehicle accidents. Why is that? Seatbelt, safer cars, exactly. So those are the places we're better, right? There's a lot of places where we're worse. What I'm going to say about all those categories where we're worse, except for two, is that most of those categories where we're worse, end-stage kidney disease, Parkinson's disease, hypertension, and Alzheimer's, those are age-related diseases. You know what? We live forever. Forever. Isn't it rare for you to look at the obituaries and be like, 72-year-old, that's so young. I see somebody who's 85 who dies, and I'm thinking, that's too young, because I'm used to seeing 95, 97. That feels like the new normal. I've never had so many people who live in the hundreds in my patients, ever. I don't remember having anybody in the hundreds in the 2000s, but I have tons of them now. Eventually, something's going to get you, and somebody's going to assign some diagnosis to you, and it's likely to be, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, end-stage renal disease. So although those numbers look higher, we don't have an Alzheimer's epidemic. We're just living really, really long. Now, there's two things up there that are really increased. Suicide has really increased, but the thing that has had a 276% increase in death rate is opiate overdose. Right? I mean, look at that graph. Look at that. That is like the worst public health model you've ever seen. It's appalling. And we created it, brought to you by the American medical system. That's the reason I do this work. This is the reason I do it, is because I am horrified that this happened. Okay, so maps, I happen to like maps. This is New York Times, this is all relatively recent. So if you look at that top map on the left, those red areas are where overdoses happen. Drug overdoses in general, it wasn't just opiates. But those red areas are where you start to see drug overdoses. And what you see in that 2003 upper left map is Appalachia lights up, and parts of the Southwest, parts of Southern California light up. And as you march your way across time, across the top row, the middle row, you see how much more red gets spread, how many more drug overdoses there are. You start to see Florida kick in, you see New England kick in. I mean, really, what part of this country has not been touched? I mean, it's the middle part of the country, that's it. So when people say Greenfield is the opiate epidemic center of the planet, I'm like, no, it's not. Everywhere it is. Every town I go to thinks they're the center. Because there's very few communities that have not been touched by this. Oh, you know what? This one I actually think is important. So for those of you that read the New York Times, last summer, do you guys remember reading this front page article from these Princeton economists, Nobel Prize winning economists, that looked at the death rate? And what it said is, look, we do statistical analysis, that's what these two do, and what we've discovered is death rate has declined. Because every year, death rate declines. We all live to we're 110. No one's ever going to die again. But what they discovered when they looked into the data is that white Americans, middle-class white Americans between the ages of 45 and 55, had a significant increase in death rate. Like every other group dropped except for the middle white Americans. People, that's me right there, exactly. And our death rate has really risen. And so all they did was the analysis, and it was like the VW emissions. They repeated it again and again, because there's no explanatory model for this. It was crazy, right? Why are white middle-class people dying? And so in this article, what they said is, maybe it was the Great Recession of 2008, maybe it was suicide, and maybe alcohol and drug abuse. That's how they linked it together. Then the New York Times came out just at the beginning part of this month. They had gone through 600,000 death certificates of this category of people. And the reason for this? Opiate overdose. Alcohol too, but really opiate overdose. So again, huge public health impact on our society. How did it all get here? I know I already told you I prescribed all the opiates for the entire planet. The truth is I'm a really good prescriber. I didn't prescribe that much. And Massachusetts is number 41 in terms of opiate prescriptions and has been a very low opiate prescriber for a long time. Low. We're a big benzo prescriber. We're number 4 in the country for benzos. For those of us in the medical community, we nod our head on that one. But so this is not a pill mill state. You can't prescribe and dispense. 90% of the oxycodone that came to New England came from Florida, and that was true from the year 2000 to 2010. And we all knew it while it was happening. We knew where the drug was coming from. And I-95 is known as Oxy Highway. And people would rent buses, air-conditioned, high-level buses with tour operators. And if you were in Kentucky or Ohio or Maine, you would get a free trip to Florida. You'd get 2 nights or 3 nights in a hotel, all meals paid for. And all you had to do was to go to 2 pain clinics a day. And you didn't need to limp in. You could just walk in, you'd get your prescriptions and your pills, because there were 900 pain clinics in Florida, in strip malls. Sometimes there'd be strip malls that had 2 different pain clinics in it. You didn't have to leave the same strip mall to get all your meds. And you would walk out with 300 pills and 2 prescriptions. And you handed it off to your tour operator, and you had a good time in Florida, and then you went back to Ohio. And you did not actively sell your drugs on the street, the tour operator did. And so 90% of the pills came straight out of Florida to New England, which is how we ended up with this problem. These are not prescriptions that came from local doctors, they came from Florida and other states. In Florida, the federal government looked at Florida and said, if you cannot get your problem under control that is now causing havoc in the rest of the country, we will cut off all federal funding. There will be no more highway funding for you, there will be no school funding. We're cutting it off, straighten it out. And Florida perked up their ears and said, I guess we should do something about this problem. So they went in and shut down, not all of them, but most of the pill mills. 37 doctors went to jail. They are incarcerated because they weren't doctors, they were drug dealers. And they are American licensed trained physicians who ran these clinics, made tens of millions of dollars. I had a DEA inspector give a talk one day, and he was showing me the pictures of the cars and the garages and the houses of those doctors. And these guys had 10 or 20 vehicles, that each cost $500,000. They were drug dealers, so they should all be locked up. But my point here is saying that a lot of our problems stem from something that we had no control over. And the problem is when you shut down all of the pills coming out of Florida, and you have a whole bunch of people addicted to opiates, what are you left with? Right? You're left with heroin. And you think Mexico wasn't watching this? You think they had no idea what was happening? They knew everything. They had converted their marijuana fields to poppies a couple years ahead of this game. Right? And we always think it all comes from Afghanistan. Everything is grown in Mexico. It's a very, very smart business. They were ready and waiting. They had their distribution planned. And what we know is that the more pure the drug has gotten over time, the less expensive it's gotten. At East Hampton, I don't know, it's probably $3.50 a bag here. It's cheap. The further away you get from the distribution site, which here is really Holyoke and Springfield, the more expensive. Northern Vermont, it's an expensive drug. Northern Maine, it's more expensive. But here, it's cheap. And when you ask EMS workers, what's the #1 drug that you're worried about? They will say heroin in those dark green states. But look at the Southwest. Why is the Southwest not worried about heroin? I'm going to tell you why, and that is this reason here. So those are states, those purple states are states where there's still on average between 1 and 1.5 opiate prescriptions per person in that state. So everybody in this room got 1 to 1.5 prescriptions for opiates last year, right? Did that happen to everybody? But in those states it did, and that's for children too, for everybody. Which means that the reason that EMS does not say their #1 drug problem is heroin in the Southwest is they have pill mills everywhere that are not shut down, that are actively working. And a huge overprescription problem in those states. And you look at New England doesn't have that overprescription problem. Actually, anywhere, I mean, Maine looks a little soft, but that's it. When you look at the states where heroin is the #1 problem, look at New England, look at Illinois. And what I'm going to say is that the pipeline is about to close down in those states, and it looks like it's getting closer and closer. The CDC, the FDA, the federal government is getting very close to really starting to tell doctors how they can prescribe. And then that day, which may happen this year or next year, where that pipeline in those states get closed down, those purple states that you saw right here will become red states. Right? Those will become states where heroin is the predominant drug. And if you think the states of Louisiana and Mississippi and Arkansas are going to have Narcan in every police car, if you think they're going to have talks like this at night, if you think they're going to put together really, really evidence-based treatment programs for individuals, then I dispute that. I'm being a little bit of a regionalist here. I happen to be a deep New Englander, but I do not anticipate public health money going for really great prevention or treatment for individuals in those states with addiction. Right? I think that prison costs are going to increase, but what do I really expect in the next 3 years? I expect tens of thousands of people will die of heroin overdoses. So, I always sound like I have low dopamine levels and I'm negative. I'm actually a really positive person. But I'm trying to be a realist about sort of what we're doing locally and what impact we can have. But we're Massachusetts. We're the fine Commonwealth of Massachusetts, right? And we can address our problem here, but we have a problem that's covering a big chunk of our entire country. And what happens in the southeast really does affect us. I'm not going to torture you on this one, but this is old data. It's 2012, and it looked at sort of where towns were where there's heavy prescribing. This has altered so much. This is the kind of slide I'm probably going to get rid of. Nobody produces this kind of image anymore. The state doesn't do this level of analysis. I wish they would, because I think what you would find is that prescriptions are going way, way down. And if you suffer with chronic pain and doing well on your opiates, you're kind of in big trouble these days, and that's not fair. And it's pretty terrible. Most people who get prescription opiates for their pain manage it well and are not addicted to their drugs, right? And they should not be getting cut off by insurance companies or by their doctors. It's wrong. So why do our kids matter with the opiate side? Think about the kids who are highest risk, right? They tend to be our athletes who get injured, because teenage athletic injuries can be big injuries. A femur fracture, football players, an ACL tear in a young teenage athlete, that's very common. Wisdom teeth, right? Wisdom teeth, exposure to opiates with wisdom teeth, or any abdominal surgery. That's a little stuffed appendix at the bottom. So that's where our teenagers are prescribed opiates, but where else do they get them? They get them out of your cabinet. So everybody in this room at this stage, 2 years ago, if I said, does everybody have their opiates gone or under lock and key? Most people probably didn't. But at this stage of the game, boy, this room better have that stuff gone, and a police take-back box or the DA drug take-back box. If you're not actively using whatever controlled substance is in your house, get it out of your house. Why would you have it there? For me, it's a ticking time bomb. Get it out. Or if you think it is under use, then get it under lock and key. So every place has a drug take-back box, right? Every police station. That's not true in the rest of the country, by the way. That's not a surprise to you, but no other country seems to have that. So signs at home that you might see of somebody who's struggling with an opiate or heroin overdose, so more time away from home, or opiate misuse, trouble with the police, that's kind of a late sign. Pawn slips, they wanted a mountain bike for their birthday desperately, and then they pawned the mountain bike the next day. That's somebody's looking for cash. That would be a major red flag. Tiny little Ziploc bags going through bottles of vinegar or bleach. Any burnt foil, chewing gum foil. I'm going to show you pictures of what things might look like, you might find. And I know I'm going to sound like I'm a crazy mom. I have 3 kids, two of whom are teenagers, one of whom's a little lower than a teenager. But I go through their rooms about once every 2 weeks. I try not to go in their rooms. They're dirty. They're not my problem. They disgust me. I get mad when I walk in their room. But I walk in every 2 rooms, and I just do a look around for this stuff here. To be honest, that's what I look around. I don't want to have bottles of Advil in my kids' room, right? They shouldn't have bottles of anything in their kids' room. I don't trust the average 14-year-old who's having premenstrual cramps to take the right amount of Tylenol and not overdose, right? The #1 cause of liver failure in teenage girls is Tylenol overdose. They shouldn't have access to things at your house. That's my opinion. They should ask an adult, right? Which is what my kids do. I have a headache. Can I take some Motrin? Sure, right? But I like them to talk to me about it. So in a room, if you saw anything that was rolled up dollar bills, the insides of pens, those are things that kids snort through, right? I mean, like the insides of anything, little tiny straws would be a common thing. Pills, if you found pills in your kid's room, that is concerning to any one of us. That top one on the right is just the cap to a needle, a syringe. That middle row there, that's one of those little glass baggies, but they also come in those little glassine wax baggies. There's no reason to have baggies in your kid's room, right? Are they beating things? No, they're not beating anything, right? Any little baggies you're finding in a room is a concern to me. Any bag with powder in it would be more than a concern to me. And when I talk to parents who brought their 23-year-old to me, I say, have you cleaned out their room from top to bottom? Have you gotten rid of everything, gone through everything, excavated the entire room? And they're like, nope. I said, go home and do it, please. And they come back sort of shell-shocked that next week. I said, how'd it go for you? And they're like, I found 10,000 plastic bags underneath the bed. And I'm like, yep. And they found all this other stuff too, but they don't look, they don't know, and I don't blame them. Like, I really hate going to my kids' room because it grosses me out, but my point is that this is your house, they're your kids, you want to make sure they're safe, do a look around for things. If you found burnt foil, there's no reason ever. What causes burnt foil? Nothing. A bent spoon that's burnt? Nothing. They shouldn't be bending spoons at all. My kids break pens because they think it's fun. I'm like, don't break any pens. It freaks me out when I find an inside of a broken pen. Just stop doing that. Stop rolling up your dollar bills because it's a nervous habit. It causes me anxiety. Stop it, please. If you're going through cotton cotton balls or Q-tips, right? Anything that would serve as a filter to get rid of the contaminant, right? If you're buying a bag of cotton balls a couple times a month, I don't know the last time anybody bought cotton balls in your house. I buy them like once every 10 years. We don't go through that many. They're either starting a nail salon in the back and you don't know it, or else they're using a lot of cotton to filter things. So that would be a concern. Finding in your kid's room a straight edge razor, no. Right? That's a potential cutting episode, of course, but also there should be no straight edge anything in your kid's room. They're not scraping the windows, we know that. So my point is you want to look for concerning items in the kid's room. I think that's reasonable as an adult. What is up there that you don't see?
What's the difference?
That is a cap to a soda bottle. And so sometimes when you're mixing up the drug, you'll put it in a little tiny disposable container. But you know what? You're going to find caps of soda bottles in lots of kids' rooms, I guess. I don't know. I would tell my kids stop that. Stop that 100%. So my point is, things are going to freak you out, then tell your kids to stop doing that. For people who don't, so I don't know who in the room has somebody they love or that they're worried about. If you have somebody in your life, you need to have Narcan at home. That's my attitude. It's available without a prescription at every Walgreens in the state of Massachusetts. To shout out to Walgreens, they've been really good on this issue. It's supposed to be available at every CVS. East Hampton CVS is available, and they're doing a good job, Chair? Okay. Our CVS in Greenfield is doing a terrible job. They won't give it to you until you tell them for whom it's being used, right? But that's crazy, right? So you can walk into any Walgreens or CVS in East Hampton without a prescription and say, I'd like some Narcan, please. Thank you. You don't need to know why, I need to just give it to me. Thank you. And it gets run under your insurance card. Mine costs $10. I have Blue Cross Blue Shield. If you have somebody you love, you're worried about, a niece, nephew, something, if you think you're a first responder, if you're the kind of person that ends up being sort of considered the first responder in a situation, which is why I carry it on me, you should have it. The East Hampton schools have it?
No.
Tell me the school nurse here has it.
No, we do not have it in our schools.
The fire department has it. I make an argument pretty strongly that every school should have it. I want you to ask yourself the last time you had an anaphylactic shock in the school and how many EpiPens you have. And the likelihood of there being an adult, a teacher, staff member, or a kid, all I need is one, who has an opiate use disorder and is found down in this auditorium, is certainly greater than 0, okay? And waiting for fire is great, but that may be 4 minutes away. And every school nurse, I've made this argument again and again, should have Narcan available to them to use in their schools. It is nothing to use, it is a Good Samaritan thing. You just shove it up somebody's nose. What if I shove it up every nose in this room? Unless you're on an opiate, it will not affect you. What if you're having a seizure? It will not help your seizures, it will not harm you. What if you're having an overdose from benzos? It will not help you, right? It will reverse the overdose from an opiate. And in fact, nothing else will. You can sit there and do your little rescue breathing as much as you want, but nothing will make that person wake up and breathe again until Narcan comes on scene. So I think there is no reason that a public school should not have it, and why it is not mandated by DPH is unknown to me. It should be in every school, and I have to say it's in a lot of schools locally. Am I wrong, Chair? Wait. Yeah. Franklin County, every school has it. Yeah. So you're going to go to this website, and this website is called, oh, this is my prescribe to prevent. This is one website. There's another website called getnaloxonenow.org. They have YouTube videos. And they have YouTube videos that say how to recognize somebody with an opiate overdose. Type that into YouTube tonight, there'll be 200, maybe not that many videos. People are bluish, they're white bluish, they're breathing very shallowly, like they may be breathing two a minute, right? That's very shallow breathing, or they're not breathing at all. I tell you, if I found a young person down, I will automatically presume it's an opiate overdose until otherwise proven. Until I've used the Narcan 3 times and I'm not reviving them, then maybe I think it's something else. But otherwise, you should presume it's an opiate overdose at this stage. That's I think, fair in our society, right? In that it's not uncommon, and I'm thrilled that EMS has it. I'm thrilled that fire has it. I'm thrilled that the police have it. That is thanks to District Attorney Dave Sullivan. He paid for it out of his budget. He just wrote a check and got it into every police car, in every place it belonged, and trained everybody. But not many DAs did that. So, and in a school, what we do at I'm the school director, the medical director at Pioneer Valley Regional School, and so our school nurses have had it for 2 or 3 years now. They've never had to use it, but at our school, we're the biggest venue in the county. People come all the time to a basketball game, or our town meetings are in our auditorium. You don't know who's going to be there, and having access to Narcan to reverse an overdose, I think is basic medical care. That's my opinion. So I'm sorry if I just called you guys out. I apologize for that. I'm happy to talk about it more. I didn't top the superintendent of the school board. I was the medical director, and I wrote an order, the same way I write my order for EpiPen and Benadryl every year. I said, we will have this, it will happen, and it happened. Okay, books. I'm at the end. So these are 4 great books that I've read recently or in the last few years. And if you are interested in addiction in general, if you want to inform yourself more, if you want to inform friends, these are the 4 I like the most. And for those of you who are interested in the trauma component of what we discussed, because you're an educator, you're a worker, taking out your smartphone is a good time if you want to take pictures of these, or I can send the slides out or whatever. But that book up top, The Body Keeps Score, is the best book on trauma and what it does to the human body that I've ever read. It's a beautifully written book. I've read it again and again. I keep reaching out towards it. He's a BU psychiatrist. He's superb. That's a great book. The book on In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, he's a wonderful family doctor from Canada who really helps you understand. Has anybody read some of these books? A handful of them. Which one have you read, Ruth?
Chasing the Scream.
Chasing the Scream. Is that a great book? Oh, mixed feelings. Okay, that's good feedback then. And then, Chasing the Scream. I thought you were in the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. I had very mixed feelings about Chasing the Scream too. Thank you for saying that, actually. I read it and I had very mixed feelings too. But it's worthwhile because what that book covers is failed drug policy in the Western world. That actually, the person in the back who said they work in the prison system, who said that? Yeah. So, locking people up for their addiction doesn't make them much better. So let's spend a minute talking about dopamine. I told you grades get better, right? What does it take to build dopamine again? How do people get better? Who said time? Time. Time matters, right? Detoxes for 5 days doesn't do anything. Nothing to do. 30 days of sobriety for opiates, that's like you finally can take a breath. 3 months, they may start to clear their head. People need really 12, 15, 18, 24 months of sobriety before they can start to really get normalized brains. And what happens to our young people? They go to these 5-day bogus detoxes where nothing positive happens, and in fact they reset their levels and they walk out and they overdose. Those are useless, but that's what gets funded in the state. What do we really need? Because the teenagers in the up to 24s are our biggest struggle in terms of treatment. They need long-term, structured, sober living situations that are well managed by people who know what they're doing. Most of the stuff out there is junk, or it doesn't exist at all. So they need time. They need love. They need connection to other human beings. They need to be able to interact with their children and their pets. They need to have a sense of purpose in life. This is what builds dopamine, right? They need to go back to school. Does that happen in our jails? Do all those things happen in our jails? If you work at a good jail, maybe yes, right? And I have to say, I'm proud of my Western Mass jails. Hampshire County, Franklin County, Camden County are doing some of the best quality jail work out there. But you can imagine in the rest of the country, being locked up in a cell is not a place to rebuild dopamine. And you know who these people are? What'd you say?
The Howard Street jail.
I love Howard Street. Howard Street is phenomenal, and they're doing all the right work on this issue. But the average place, we could talk about our 2, 3, or 4 little jewels in Western Mass. The 97, 99% of the jails in this country are not doing this. And these people are our neighbors and our sons and our daughters who are coming right back to us, not any better than they were, in fact, likely worse, right? Because they're not given the right treatment. And if you think treatment shouldn't be happening in jail, and you should just lock them up and throw away the key, then that's on you when they move next door to you 5 years later, exactly who they were, or worse than when they got in there. We have got to provide treatment to people. And the best quality, standard of care, trauma-informed treatment has got to happen in our jails. If we're going to lock them up, at least provide them the treatment they need there.